Brandon West had never considered himself a rebel. He was methodical, balanced, and quiet by nature, more of a listener than a talker, more inclined to analyze than react. For most of his life, that mindset served him well. His work in environmental consulting required that kind of temperament. Assess the landscape, read the patterns, identify what's being neglected, and make it better. When his sister left for Costa Rica on a 2-year grant to study rainforest pollination, she offered him her suburban home as a temporary base while his off-grid property in the northern hills finished construction. He agreed, not because he loved suburban life, but because it seemed like a good place to pause, reflect, and tinker with the sustainable living ideas that had long consumed his thoughts but rarely had space to be fully tested. The neighborhood, tucked in a well-maintained pocket of town, had wide streets, evenly spaced maple trees, and an eerie kind of uniformity. Every house was a variation of the same template: beige with navy shutters, white with gray trim, all with the same manicured lawns and driveways of identical width. Brandon was used to diversity, in landscapes, in architecture, in ecosystems, and so at first this pristine suburbia felt sterile. But he was not a man who rushed to judgment. He sat up quietly, took note of the rhythm of the neighborhood, and eased into a routine that suited him. What the neighbors didn't know was that Brandon wasn't just house-sitting. He was testing a micro-model of regenerative suburban design, minimal waste, full soil cycle recycling, and compact biodiversity integration. It wasn't flashy or disruptive. He didn't tear up the lawn or put solar panels on the roof. He just started with a small flock of chickens, 6 hens, each named after an indigenous plant. They lived in a coop he built himself, tucked into the back corner of the yard, designed with vertical growing racks, an odor-neutralizing substrate, and a rainwater feeding system. To the casual observer, it looked like a modern art installation made of cedar and copper. The chickens were quiet, clean, and surprisingly popular with the neighborhood kids who began stopping by with their parents to peek through the mesh and giggle when the hens clucked softly. In less than 2 months, Brandon transformed the sterile backyard into a tiny ecosystem. He added planters of native herbs, a rain garden to filter runoff, and a compost system that fed directly into the soil under the raised beds. Everything had a function. The chickens reduced kitchen waste, fertilized the soil, and kept pests down. The plants stabilized moisture levels and invited bees. He kept records, photographs, soil samples, moisture logs, and behavioral data from the hens. It was all part of the long-term plan to replicate this on larger land. He wasn't trying to start a movement. He was running a controlled experiment, quietly and efficiently. At first, there was no resistance. The neighbors smiled in passing. Some even complimented him on the cool little setup in the back. The woman across the street, Louise, retired school principal, brought over muffins and remarked how it's nice to see someone using the land for something real. Even the couple on the corner, who rarely spoke to anyone, gave him a thumbs up when he offered them a dozen fresh eggs. Then came Karen. Brandon noticed her the same way one notices an invasive species, not by appearance but by behavior. She moved through the neighborhood like a regulator inspecting a fault line. She was new, having recently bought the largest house on the street, and wasted no time asserting herself. Within a week, she had organized a beautification committee. 2 weeks later, she delivered color-coded flyers to each house reminding everyone to maintain visual harmony in line with community expectations. When Brandon opened his, he noted that the tone read more like a mandate than a suggestion. Still, he didn't object. He made a mental note to trim the bush near the front path a bit more regularly. 3 days after the flyer, she rang his doorbell. Brandon opened the door, calm as always, expecting a neighborly chat. Karen stood with her clipboard, a pastel cardigan over a crisp white blouse, and a smile that felt too calculated to be spontaneous. She said her name as though it should mean something, and then gestured toward the backyard. "I wanted to talk to you about the livestock." Brandon blinked. The chickens? Yes, I understand you're keeping animals. That's not in line with the bylaws, she said, already scribbling something. This neighborhood doesn't allow livestock of any kind. It's a hygiene risk, not to mention a visual disruption. He kept his tone even. They're not livestock under state code. And according to zoning regulations, this area is classified as residential agricultural. Small flocks for personal use are allowed. Karen looked up. I don't know what zoning regulations you're referring to, but I think you'll find that our community has its own standards. I read them, Brandon replied. They're vague. There's no explicit mention of poultry. Only excessive animal presence. 6 hens isn't excessive. Karen stiffened. We'll see what the council says. He didn't say anything more. She left with a tight smile, and Brandon returned to his notes, trying not to let irritation settle in. But it did. Not because of her tone or the threat, but because it meant a shift had begun. The kind of slow, bureaucratic clamp that starts small and builds until it crushes initiative under paperwork and false civility. A week passed without incident. Then, one morning, Brandon received a letter. Not certified, not formal, but typed and signed by Karen in her role as acting council liaison. The language was convoluted, littered with references to communal expectations and aesthetic congruity. The fine, $4,700. The reason, unauthorized domesticated livestock housing and environmental modification without prior review. It demanded removal of the coop and animals within 72 hours. Brandon read the letter twice, then once more, slower. No clause cited. No hearing scheduled. Just a decision, made unilaterally with a fine that rivaled half a month's salary in his former consulting work. He didn't rage. He didn't call anyone. He didn't even write back. Instead, he stood in the backyard that morning, watching the chickens peck the grass beneath the elderberry bushes, and he made a different kind of decision, one not rooted in retaliation or protest, but in design. If they wanted to make this about aesthetics, then aesthetics they would get. And if Karen's authority only extended to the private yards of individual homes, then perhaps it was time to shift the conversation to another space, one that technically belonged to no one, maintained by no budget, ignored by the same council that now declared war over 6 silent hens. That space was the fountain. It sat at the end of the block in a small grassy square that once might have been considered a park. The fountain hadn't worked in years. It was dry, cracked, and filled with cigarette butts, dead leaves, and the occasional soda can. Children never played there. No one gardened around it. It had become invisible, a dead structure in a living place. But to Brandon, it was opportunity. A forgotten place, outside of ownership, free from Karen's red pen. That night, while the streetlights flickered and silence draped itself over the uniform lawns, Brandon began drawing. Not sketches of rebellion, but blueprints of adaptation. The chickens would stay. The structure would shift. And if the rules punished function, he'd answer with form, something so undeniably considered, so functionally beautiful, that they'd have to think twice before trying to bury it under their paper fines. The game had changed, but Brandon was a strategist, and he was just getting started. Brandon knew there were moments in life that didn't feel monumental at first glance, but in hindsight, they marked the start of something irreversible. The letter he received from the neighborhood council, printed on flimsy off-white paper and folded into thirds like a generic flyer, was one of those moments. It hadn't come through official channels, no seal, no date of issuance from a legal department, just a printed name. Karen Whitmore, Council Liaison, and a signature that looked practiced but not professional. It carried no legal weight by itself, yet it hummed with condescension and informal threat, as if the mere presence of her name was enough to silence opposition. What struck Brandon wasn't the fine itself, though the amount was ludicrous. It was the complete absence of process. No notice, no inquiry, no chance to address concerns. Just a demand: remove the chickens, demolish the coop, and pay nearly $5,000 within 10 business days. He read the letter while sitting in his backyard, sunlight pouring through the canopy of his mulberry tree, the chickens milling about quietly in their enclosure. The absurdity of it clashed with the peace of the space. Nothing in the scene around him suggested offense or violation. There were no smells, no noise, no visual intrusion. If anything, his setup looked more curated than most of the neighboring yards, with their sterile patios and plastic landscaping. The letter might as well have accused him of harboring wild predators or building a fireworks factory. It made no sense until he remembered who had signed it. Karen had taken a dislike to the chickens from day one, not because they disrupted her life, but because she couldn't control them. They weren't part of her aesthetic order, and worse, people seemed to like them. They represented something she hadn't authorized. Brandon didn't react impulsively. He didn't post about it online. He didn't storm into a meeting. Instead, he took his copy of the letter and went straight to city records. He wanted clarity: who actually held jurisdiction over what in the neighborhood, and which clauses of governance allowed this sort of action. The receptionist at the city planning office, a young man named Cole who seemed perpetually on the edge of boredom, raised an eyebrow when Brandon explained his situation. He typed for a few minutes, then muttered something about zoning overlays and communal development designations. When the documents came out, Brandon studied them carefully, page by page. What he found was as enlightening as it was disturbing. The council had no legitimate authority to impose fines of that magnitude unilaterally. They could request compliance, escalate to city enforcement for egregious violations, or submit formal complaints. But issuing a penalty without due process? Completely overstepping. Worse, the coop didn't even fall within restricted guidelines. According to the city's zoning codes, backyard hens, under 10 in number with no roosters, were permitted for personal, non-commercial use. Brandon's setup was not only compliant, but a textbook case of responsible execution. He documented all of this, took copies, and began building his own archive of evidence. Meanwhile, something shifted in the air. The tone in the neighborhood began to dull. A few neighbors stopped waving. Others, who had once asked for fresh eggs or complimented his compost setup, now crossed the street to avoid conversation. It wasn't overt hostility. It was hesitation, like people sensing conflict and not wanting to be caught in the blast radius. Brandon didn't blame them. It was how these councils operated, not with force, but with subtle social pressure. Make an example of someone, apply enough procedural ambiguity, and most people would fold to keep the peace. Karen, of course, was not idle. Within the week, Brandon received another envelope. Not from her directly this time, but from the neighborhood newsletter which she now apparently edited. In it was a passive-aggressive article titled "Preserving Harmony in Shared Spaces," which featured a section about unauthorized animal projects and disruptions to the visual environment. His coop wasn't mentioned by name, but the implications were clear. He was being painted as a problem, an eccentric with odd projects who was degrading the uniformity of the community. Brandon considered holding a neighborhood meeting, presenting his case with documentation and inviting open dialogue. But something stopped him. He realized Karen was baiting him, hoping he'd react in a way that made her seem reasonable by comparison. If he got emotional, she'd twist it into a narrative of instability. If he stood defiant, she'd say he was unwilling to cooperate. What she didn't expect, he guessed, was silence. So he gave it to her. But silence didn't mean inaction. At night, he sketched. During the day, he researched. And he began collecting information, not about chickens, but about the neighborhood itself. He reviewed records of previous complaints, council appointments, budget allocations. What he found was interesting. The Fountain Plaza at the end of the street, once marked as a shared green space, had been removed from the official maintenance budget 5 years ago due to funding cuts. Since then, it had quietly become a no man's land, falling outside the active jurisdiction of the neighborhood council but never absorbed by the city for repurposing. It was neglected, cracked, unused. The perfect blind spot. He began visiting the plaza more frequently, standing in front of the dry fountain and imagining how it could be transformed. He measured its dimensions, noted the drainage patterns, checked the soil composition in the adjacent garden beds. Then he filed a request with the city under a public reuse initiative, a program that allowed private citizens to submit proposals for the adaptive use of abandoned or unmanaged public structures. It was a long shot, but it was legal, and more importantly, it would reroute the narrative. If his chickens were a threat to visual harmony, then perhaps placing them in a designated, revitalized community exhibit space would expose how little the objections had to do with practicality and everything to do with control. The approval didn't come overnight. Bureaucracy is slow even when it works in your favor. But while he waited, Brandon prepared. He dismantled the backyard coop, disassembled the panels, cleaned the parts, and began modifying them for the plaza installation. Neighbors noticed, but no one said anything. Karen walked by once, slow and deliberate, but kept her eyes fixed ahead, lips pressed in a thin line. She knew something was happening, but she didn't know what. That uncertainty Brandon hoped would work in his favor. When the city email arrived, it was terse but affirmative. His proposal had been approved for a trial period of 90 days, after which an evaluation would determine if the project could remain. No funding, no promotion, just quiet permission to build. That was enough. On a Thursday night, under a moon half-shaded in clouds, Brandon moved everything to the Fountain Plaza. He worked alone, but efficiently, his movements measured, deliberate. He didn't rush. He knew the acoustics of the street, which tiles made noise, which bolts needed extra torque. By dawn, the dry basin had been transformed. The structure was elegant. Geometric tiers of cedar framing, integrated planter boxes, a self-contained compost chamber, and discreet roosting nooks nestled above the center platform. The chickens, calm and unfazed, adjusted immediately. From a distance, the installation looked more like modern public art than a coop. By sunrise, it was complete. Brandon didn't post signs. He didn't send emails. He didn't knock on doors. He just returned to his house, made coffee, and sat by the window. The plaza was visible from his porch, and within an hour, the first reaction came. A jogger slowed, stared, and walked closer. Then a couple with their child approached. By midday, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring, pointing, occasionally laughing, not in mockery but in surprise. Karen appeared by late afternoon. She didn't speak. She didn't approach. She stood at the edge of the plaza, arms crossed, surveying the structure like a general who had discovered her territory had been redrawn. Her expression was unreadable, a blend of confusion and brewing rage. She took out her phone and snapped a photo. Brandon didn't flinch. The move had been made. Not reckless, not defiant, but strategic. The chickens had never been the threat. The threat was the idea that someone could live just outside the lines of control and make it work. And now that idea sat in the middle of the community square, silent and undeniable. Karen would retaliate. He was sure of that, but Brandon was ready. By the time the fountain chicken habitat became a staple of neighborhood conversation, Brandon had already anticipated the counterstrike. He wasn't naive. While most people responded to unexpected change with curiosity, Karen responded with recalibration. She would not lash out in the open or concede defeat in any straightforward way. She would maneuver, search for a technicality, a loophole, some obscure procedural step to dismantle what she could not control outright. And so Brandon didn't waste time celebrating the positive attention his installation was receiving from passers-by or the quiet nods from neighbors who had previously distanced themselves. Instead, he focused on reinforcing the setup. Every panel was secured with weatherproof bolts. The structural supports were anchored deeper into the foundation than necessary. A discrete sensor tracked moisture, air quality, and heat signatures, not just for data collection, but to prove sanitary and humane conditions if ever challenged. He mounted a small solar-powered camera on a nearby lamppost with city approval, citing public safety monitoring for community installations. Every inch of the structure, every action taken, was defensible. For 3 days, there was no response from Karen or the council. Brandon knew that didn't mean inaction. It meant strategy. On the 4th day, a warning was posted on the community bulletin board by the walking trail, laminated and neatly pinned under a plastic shield. It was unsigned but clearly written by Karen. The language was passive, vague, and yet unmistakably pointed. All community installations must adhere to current aesthetic and health standards. Unauthorized structures may be subject to formal removal pending review. The message carried no citation, no procedural outline, just a shadow of authority meant to imply consequences without declaring them. Brandon took a photo of the notice and archived it. Then he removed it calmly, documenting the time, date, and condition of the board, and left no trace that it had ever been there. That night, something changed. At 3:17 a.m., Brandon's motion sensor sent a silent alert to his phone. He checked the camera feed instantly. On screen, under the soft glow of the public lamppost, 2 figures in hooded sweatshirts moved around the chicken habitat. One stood by the base with a tool bag while the other circled, glancing around nervously. Brandon didn't shout. He didn't go out to confront them. He didn't need to. He watched, silent, as the 2 attempted to loosen a supporting bolt and then recoiled, realizing it had been torque-locked. One of them reached up to fiddle with a hinge near the Coop's ventilation module, only to slip and knock over a bucket of water Brandon had left intentionally. They froze, clearly startled, then quickly fled, leaving behind the tool bag and a scratched section of the cedar paneling. By dawn, Brandon had filed a police report, not out of panic but to establish record. He didn't name names. He didn't speculate. He simply submitted the footage, the timestamp, and the description. The officer who arrived to take the statement was young, tired-looking, and professional. He watched the footage silently before nodding and stating flatly that this looked like a targeted act of vandalism, but with no clear identifiers, charges would be unlikely unless someone came forward. Brandon accepted this without protest. He wasn't seeking an arrest. He was building a record. When institutions failed to protect, paper trails became your shield. The next evening, the chickens were quiet. They had adjusted to the new environment seamlessly, unbothered by the open space or curious visitors. Brandon, however, knew calm was never permanent in conflicts like this. He sat on his porch, not out of paranoia, but preparation. Just after 8 p.m., Karen walked by. She didn't stop, she didn't speak, but she slowed, just enough to look at him, her eyes betraying calculation. Then, in the morning, Brandon received a formal letter, this time delivered via courier, not mailed. The seal bore the council's insignia. Finally, something official. Inside was a cease and desist request, not legally binding, but phrased in such a way that most residents would be intimidated. It referenced city code without quoting it, warned of liability in case of animal-related incidents, and urged immediate reassessment of the project's long-term viability. Brandon didn't respond. Instead, he forwarded it to a local attorney with experience in property use disputes, a woman named Mallory who had successfully defended several urban garden projects from similar attacks. Mallory reviewed the materials, then requested a site visit. When she arrived, she was crisp, no nonsense, and asked questions like an engineer rather than a lawyer. How deep were the anchors? What was the load rating of the elevated tiers? How often were the water reservoirs cleaned? Brandon answered every inquiry with precision, providing measurements, logs, and photographic records. By the end of her inspection, she smiled faintly and said, "They're going to have a very hard time making this go away quietly." 3 days later, the sanitation department arrived. They claimed to be conducting a routine inspection of public use areas and had received an anonymous complaint regarding animal feces in community walkways. The accusation was absurd. Brandon's setup was self-contained, elevated, and included a runoff filtration system. Still, he allowed the inspector access, accompanied him through the installation, and watched as the man grew increasingly uncomfortable. Everything was clean, documented, overbuilt even. The inspector eventually muttered that the complaint had clearly been exaggerated and left without issuing any kind of citation. But the pressure didn't stop. The next attempt came through a sudden vote held during a council session scheduled less than 24 hours in advance. The item on the agenda, buried between discussions of flower bed budgets and sidewalk repair allocations, read, "Motion to reclassify underused public zones as passive green space to prevent unsanctioned activity." In essence, it was a backdoor attempt to remove the chicken habitat by declaring the entire plaza off-limits to physical structures. Brandon wasn't notified. Only residents subscribed to the digital council bulletin received notice, and he had been mysteriously unsubscribed without his knowledge. Fortunately, Mallory caught wind of the agenda and filed a petition for injunction that same afternoon, halting the vote under the claim of procedural violation. The council was forced to postpone. Karen's response was immediate and visible. That evening, 3 plastic signs were staked around the plaza. Red text on white background. Notice, pending zoning review, entry restricted. No city seal, no official approval, just intimidation. Brandon documented them, removed them, and submitted a formal complaint to the city zoning office. But it was what happened next that made everything personal. Brandon returned home 2 nights later to find his front yard vandalized. Not destroyed, not burned or shattered, but marked. Someone had overturned his compost bins, scattered chicken feed across the driveway, and spray-painted a red X on the side of his garden box. It was silent, cruel, and specific. He stood there for a long time, not moving, the chickens clucking softly behind the house, unaware of the message left for their owner. He didn't clean it up immediately. He took photographs. He called Mallory. He called the police. And then he called the city again, this time requesting an emergency meeting with a public mediator. No longer was this about bylaws, or zoning, or even the chickens. It had become a question of rights, of whether a person could be slowly pushed to the edges of their community simply for doing something different, something not loud, not chaotic, but merely inconvenient to those who feared autonomy more than disorder. Brandon had remained calm, measured, and within the law, but now he had begun to shift, not toward retaliation, but toward assertion, the kind that doesn't knock, doesn't yell, doesn't explain. It just builds. By the end of the week, Brandon had secured a permit to expand the installation, citing educational value. He began designing a second tier, an observation deck for kids to learn about sustainable food systems. It would be clean, minimal, and within code, but above all, it would be visible, not in defiance, in demonstration. Karen wasn't going to back down, but neither was he. The game had entered its next stage. Brandon had never believed in symbolic victories. He found no satisfaction in being praised for doing what was right, especially when those praises came from people who had only weeks earlier turned their backs to avoid conflict. He didn't need admiration. He needed results, protection, and a future that didn't require constant defense against bureaucratic sabotage. Yet even he couldn't ignore what began to shift in the neighborhood once the observation platform took shape. Children visited daily now, led by curious parents, some of whom had previously scoffed at his backyard ecosystem, but now watched silently as their sons and daughters leaned forward, wide-eyed, to learn about compost cycles, symbiotic pollination, and closed-loop systems. He didn't proselytize. He explained when asked and let the space do the rest. And still Karen said nothing. She had gone unusually quiet. No meetings, no letters, no public announcements. The Digital Council Board hadn't been updated in nearly 2 weeks. Brandon suspected that silence wasn't resignation, but recalibration. The last time she vanished this way, she returned with coordinated complaints and a sudden procedural ambush disguised as civic oversight. So he waited, watched, and fortified, both the structure itself and his position with the city. Mallory had filed an advisory request with the Office of Community Development to have the project reclassified as an educational demonstration site, which would grant it additional protections under a state-funded sustainability pilot program. It was a long process, and approval wasn't guaranteed, but it was a start. Then came the letter. Unlike the others, this one didn't arrive folded in his mailbox or pushed under his door. It was delivered directly to his porch, placed carefully atop a stack of egg cartons he had left out for pickup by a neighbor. The envelope was unmarked. Inside, however, was a single page typed in dense bureaucratic language, topped with the seal of the county's Environmental Standards Department. The notice claimed that Brandon's installation had triggered a health inspection after multiple reports of improper waste handling and air quality degradation in a public use space. The language was technical, impersonal, and clinical, exactly how Karen liked to strike. Brandon's first instinct was disbelief. He had logged every sanitation step, kept digital records of odor levels through an industrial sensor he'd installed, and could provide soil and moisture data on demand. He knew there was no violation. But the letter wasn't about truth. It was about escalation. Now the attack came from outside the neighborhood structure, redirected through county-level channels that were harder to access and far more difficult to reason with. He contacted Mallory immediately, and she confirmed his suspicion. Karen had filed the complaints not through the neighborhood, but directly to the county using anonymous digital forms, masking them as community concern from multiple sources. The inspection was scheduled for Friday. Brandon didn't panic. He doubled his documentation, printed backup logs, gathered testimonial notes from neighbors who had visited the site and could vouch for its condition. He even installed a new filtration module 2 days before the inspection, an overbuilt, high-efficiency system designed for commercial-level poultry operations. The cost was not insignificant, but it was less than a court battle. He knew what this was, the midpoint in a siege, the part where the enemy switches from noise to precision, trying to wound you with paper instead of force. Friday arrived with an overcast sky and a faint drizzle that seemed to mute the world into anticipation. The inspector was prompt. A woman in her 50s with a clipboard and a laminated badge, her expression neither friendly nor hostile. She introduced herself with a level tone and made it clear she would evaluate by the book, not by gossip or assumption. Brandon appreciated that. He walked her through the installation step by step, explaining the ventilation systems, the drainage filtration, the nutrient cycle chart that showed how the coop integrated with the nearby planter beds. She asked direct questions, took photos, and said little else. The chickens remained calm throughout, perched on their tiered roosts as if they too understood the weight of the moment. The inspection lasted nearly 90 minutes. When it was over, the inspector gave a small nod and told Brandon he would receive a formal notice within 3 business days. She neither confirmed nor denied concerns, just followed protocol, thanked him for his cooperation, and left. Brandon stood in silence after she departed, feeling not fear, but fatigue, the kind that comes not from defeat, but from having to prove the obvious again and again to people who never intended to listen in the first place. 3 days passed in tense quiet. Then, on Monday morning, the result arrived by email. No violations identified. Case closed. Brandon read it 3 times before allowing himself to breathe. He forwarded the notice to Mallory, archived it, and printed a copy to post discreetly on the edge of the installation. He didn't frame it, didn't gloat, just made it available for anyone who still believed whispers and unsigned flyers carried more weight than facts. And still, Karen didn't surface. Brandon began to wonder if she had finally run out of avenues. But deep down, he knew better. That night, as he sat on the edge of the plaza under the glow of the solar lamps, a new sound disrupted the quiet. The roar of a high-pressure hose. He turned instinctively, eyes narrowing as a city maintenance truck pulled up to the opposite curb. 3 workers in reflective jackets stepped out, one of them carrying a gas-powered pressure washer. Brandon stood and walked slowly toward them, calm but alert. "Evening," he said. "Didn't know a cleaning was scheduled." One of the men shrugged. "Request came through this afternoon. Something about sanitation. Just washing down the walkway." Brandon paused. "This area isn't scheduled for maintenance. It's listed as low priority on the department chart. That means requests need supervisory approval." The man blinked. "Well, we got it. Can I see it?" The man hesitated, then pulled out a work order. Brandon scanned it quickly. The request had been routed through an internal form, marked Urgent Sanitation Need, approved with a signature Brandon didn't recognize. It was real, but barely. He stepped back and let them work. By the time they were done, the walkway glistened unnaturally clean, the area around the Coop saturated with runoff. It wasn't sabotage, but it was a message. They wanted to remind him that access and paperwork could be weaponized at any time. Brandon didn't sleep much that night. He woke early, inspected the installation, and confirmed no damage had been done. Still, he installed a perimeter moisture alarm around the base of the structure, just in case. Then he went inside, brewed a stronger pot of coffee than usual, and began drafting his next application to register the plaza as a protected demonstration site under the state's Sustainable Micro-Agriculture Initiative. It was a long shot, more complicated, and required endorsements from educational institutions. But he knew people. He had data. And, more than anything, he had time. Brandon didn't need Karen's approval, or even the neighborhood's sympathy. He just needed enough infrastructure, legal, structural, and social, to make it impossible for anyone to erase his work with a stroke of a pen or whispered accusation. They hadn't broken anything yet, but they'd tried, and now he was building something stronger than even they understood. If Brandon had learned anything in his months of quiet resistance, it was that escalation rarely announced itself with noise. It crept in disguised as paperwork, arrived dressed in false civility, and spoke in the language of compliance and community standards. What came next wasn't a knock at the door or another passive-aggressive letter. It was silence, too clean to be. Trusted, too still to mean peace. He felt it in the way the neighborhood quieted around him again, not with judgment this time, but with caution. People weren't choosing sides anymore. They were watching to see what would happen next, and that, in a conflict shaped by politics and perception, meant he had become something more than just a neighbor with chickens. He had become a test case. Whether they admitted it or not, everyone wanted to know if someone like him, with no official position and no desire for power, could stand against the mechanisms of control and still keep his footing. Karen remained unseen, but Brandon knew she was active. The sudden reappearance of her name in the city coordination logs, tied to vaguely phrased community alignment efforts, confirmed that she had shifted her strategy again, this time working from behind institutional curtains, making calls instead of appearances. Her newest maneuver came not from a complaint, but from a proposal, cleverly veiled as a beautification grant, pitched to the city's Public Spaces Committee. The grant's intent was described in glowing terms: revitalize neglected green zones, unify visual aesthetics across shared public spaces, and create a community-standard design template for local micro-projects. Nowhere in the document was Brandon's installation named, but it didn't have to be. The proposed plans included a complete redesign of the plaza, with open gravel terraces and seasonal flower beds replacing outdated or unauthorized structures. Brandon's Coop wasn't unauthorized. It had temporary clearance. But temporary meant fragile. If the city approved the grant and the project moved forward, it wouldn't require a formal takedown, just a reclassification. His structure would be an interim anomaly, something quietly cleared to make way for cohesive community vision. And because the proposal framed the redesign as beautification and public engagement, resistance would be painted as obstructionism. No matter how valid, Brandon didn't panic. He called Mallory and sent her a full copy of the grant file. She reviewed it in silence, then replied with a simple assessment. "They're trying to cut your legs out under the guise of progress. We need to expose the conflict of interest." He understood immediately. The proposal named a contracting firm to implement the plaza redesign, Burlow Urban Concepts. The owner of Burlow was registered as Kevin D. Whitmore, Karen's son. Now the stakes were clear. They weren't just trying to remove the chickens, they were trying to cash in on the land. Brandon had turned an abandoned lot into something functional and living, and now, as its value and visibility increased, the council wanted to seize the space back under the language of order and elegance, paving over his work for the sake of profit, disguised as uniformity. Brandon wasn't looking for revenge, but he wouldn't retreat. With Mallory's help, he filed a formal ethics complaint to the Public Spaces Committee, citing nepotism and undisclosed financial interest. He didn't need to prove criminal intent, just show that Karen had hidden her connection to the proposal's primary contractor. While that complaint was being reviewed, he moved quickly to secure institutional allies. One of his former consulting colleagues worked at the local college's environmental science department. Brandon invited her for a walkthrough, explained the project's origin, and proposed a partnership to turn the Coop into a living demonstration lab for sustainable urban agriculture. She was intrigued and, more importantly, supportive. Within a week, the department sent a letter of endorsement for the project and submitted a parallel proposal to the city to designate the site as a temporary research zone. Karen's proposal was now entangled in a bureaucratic knot she hadn't expected. Still, she didn't fold. 2 nights later, someone returned to the plaza. Brandon didn't catch them in the act, but the aftermath was deliberate. Someone had cut through the enclosure's solar wiring, ripped the feeder system from its mount, and poured a bag of construction lime across the planter beds, effectively destroying weeks of careful soil cycling. The chickens, thankfully, were unharmed. Brandon had moved them temporarily to a secure shelter in anticipation of possible retaliation. But the structure had been violated, its systems damaged, and the message was unmistakable. You may have the law, but we have access. Brandon stood in the dark for a long time that night, staring at the damage. This time, he didn't feel shock. He felt precision. This wasn't vandalism born of frustration, it was calculated. And it told him something crucial. They were losing patience. The next morning, he filed another police report. Mallory added the incident to the ethics complaint, citing it as evidence of harassment potentially tied to the grant dispute. Brandon, in turn, contacted the city's Urban Agriculture Bureau, requesting an emergency site review. They arrived 2 days later, surveyed the damage, reviewed his documentation, and issued a temporary protection order for the installation, citing disruption of an active community engagement site under review. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a new layer of defense. The most surprising shift came that weekend, when Brandon received a knock at his door. Not a courier, not a city agent, but a neighbor. Louise, the retired school principal. She looked tired, unsure, and embarrassed. "I voted for the plaza redesign," she said before he could speak. "I didn't know what it meant. It just sounded nice. But this isn't about design anymore, is it?" Brandon invited her in. Over tea, she listened as he walked her through the grant, the connections, the history. He didn't dramatize or accuse. He simply showed her what he knew, what had happened, and what was at stake. Louise left that evening with a folder of documents and a quiet promise. "I'll talk to the others." Over the next week, Brandon noticed something shift. The silence in the neighborhood began to lift, replaced by quiet discussions on porches and sidewalks. A few neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now waved. Others stopped by to ask if the chickens were safe or if they could help replant the ruined beds. It wasn't a revolution, but it was movement. Slow, grounded, and real. Karen responded with speed. The next neighborhood council bulletin announced a surprise community cleanup initiative to be held the following weekend, focused, of course, on the plaza. The stated purpose: removing damaged or unsanitary materials and preparing the space for restoration. Brandon was not invited to contribute. The message was clear. They were going to tear it down under the banner of community service, make it look like an act of generosity. Mallory immediately filed for an injunction. The judge, to Brandon's surprise, granted a temporary halt to all unlicensed modifications to the site pending resolution of the ethics review. Karen was furious. He could see it in the tersely worded response she submitted to the city, questioning the legitimacy of Brandon's project, accusing him of exploiting legal loopholes, and describing the entire structure as a disruptive eyesore posing biological risk. The city requested an independent evaluation. 2 days later, a team of engineers and environmental scientists arrived. They took samples, recorded footage, interviewed Brandon, reviewed blueprints, and even asked to speak with the schoolchildren who had visited the installation. Brandon provided everything, including soil analyses, humidity logs, maintenance schedules, and before and after visuals. The lead evaluator was a man in his early 40s who said little but nodded often. At the end of the day, he turned to Brandon and said simply, "This is a legitimate site, and frankly, it's cleaner than most commercial farms I've audited." Karen's campaign was unraveling, but the damage she had already done, the stress, the financial strain, the physical sabotage, couldn't be undone. Brandon was tired, visibly so, and even as protections were added, endorsements secured, and voices turned in his favor, he understood that the fight hadn't truly ended. These kinds of battles didn't close with a ruling or a report. They ended only when the will to fight was exhausted, or when the opposition had no more weapons to use. And Karen wasn't done. The final blow came through zoning reform. Quietly, discreetly, a proposal was submitted to the City Council to amend the municipal zoning definitions around urban micro-agriculture. The changes were minor, almost invisible. New setback requirements, reclassification of enclosure, dimensions, limits on educational use in shared spaces. But Brandon caught it, and so did Mallory. The proposal, if passed, would invalidate his entire installation without naming it directly. This wasn't about code anymore. It was about removing him from the map, as if he had never existed. But Brandon had learned. He had built not just structures but alliances. And now it was time to use them. The zoning amendment proposal arrived on a Thursday, slipped into the City Council's digital docket like a seed hidden in mulch, obscure in its phrasing but potent in its consequence. The language was clinical, a minor adjustment in section identifiers, subclauses revised to specify new structural limits for temporary agriculture-related enclosures within shared-use residential zones. It didn't mention Brandon's installation, the chickens, or the plaza. It didn't need to. Every line had been written with surgical intent, a scalpel disguised as a brushstroke. If passed, the changes wouldn't just render his project non-compliant, It would effectively erase the legal path he had built to protect it. This was not an attack with noise and fury. It was the final act of control, written in the language of permanence. Brandon received the forwarded proposal from Mallory late that evening. Her message was terse. "They're going for the throat." He read it once, then again, then printed the document and laid it on his kitchen table beneath the soft hum of the pendant lamp, tracing the clauses with his finger like one might examine a blueprint before demolition. He understood what was at stake. This was not about whether his chickens could stay. This was about whether any future version of what he had built could exist again, anywhere in that city. The plaza had become a symbol, not because of its appearance but because of what it represented. A living contradiction to bureaucratic homogeneity, an ecosystem born not of permission but initiative. If the amendment passed, Karen would win without needing to touch his structure again. The city would quietly dismantle his legacy with a single vote, and she would never need to speak his name. But she had miscalculated one thing. Brandon hadn't spent these months simply defending himself. He had documented everything, not just soil reports and sanitation logs, but timelines, interactions, video clips, and evidence of sabotage. He had built a dossier, not as a weapon, but as insulation. He hadn't used it because until now the attacks had been local, the damage repairable. But zoning law was different. It was public, lasting, and indiscriminate. If they succeeded here, it wouldn't just affect him. It would set a precedent to snuff out any grassroots sustainability effort within city limits under the illusion of administrative neatness. So he acted. Within 24 hours, Mallory filed a formal public challenge to the amendment. Brandon, meanwhile, submitted a community impact statement, co-signed by the Environmental Science Department at the local university and accompanied by documentation from the state's Pilot Agriculture Office. He compiled a visual presentation of the installation's evolution from blighted concrete basin to active educational hub. He included signed letters from neighbors who had visited, learned, contributed. Not appeals to emotion, but testimonies of benefit, structured like professional audits. Karen's sleek amendments would now face a mountain of grounded empirical opposition. But what he hadn't expected, what truly shifted the battlefield, was the voice that came from inside the system. 2 days before the council hearing, Louise appeared on his doorstep again, this time not as a curious neighbor, but with a flash drive in her hand and a quiet apology in her eyes. She had served on the neighborhood council's advisory committee until recently, unaware that Karen had exploited her signature on several internal documents used to validate the plaza redevelopment proposal. What she brought Brandon was a copy of an internal thread, emails between Karen, her son Kevin, and a city planning associate who had helped ghostwrite the zoning amendment. The contents weren't criminal, but they were damning. They showed premeditation, intent to remove the installation under the guise of modernization, and undisclosed financial overlap through contracting bids tied to Burlow urban concepts. Brandon read them silently. Then he passed them to Mallory. The morning of the hearing arrived with cold clarity. Brandon didn't speak first. Mallory presented the case methodically, leading with the ethics complaint, the email evidence, and the zoning proposal's conflict with state pilot protections. She didn't accuse, she exposed, she showed the overlap in contractor names, the time-stamped messaging, and the abruptness with which the amendment had been drafted and pushed to vote without adequate public review. Her tone was not angry. It was surgical. When Brandon finally stepped forward, he didn't speak of Karen or sabotage or the past months of battle. He spoke of systems, of forgotten land, of a fountain that had been neglected for 7 years until someone found a use for it. He described his chickens, not as pets, not as novelty, but as part of a closed-loop cycle. He detailed the metrics: waste reduction, soil health, community interaction. He showed photos of children observing the co-op, learning to plant. He said nothing radical, nothing emotional, just this: you don't have to like what I built, but you have to admit it works. And if you vote to destroy that possibility, then the message isn't about order or planning. It's about fear of difference. Then he stepped down. Karen sat near the back, arms folded, expression unreadable. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her conflicts of interest had barred her from participating in the public portion of the hearing. The vote came 2 hours later. The amendment failed, 3-2. Brandon didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He simply breathed. Deep, measured, quiet. It was not a full victory. Karen remained on the council. The plaza was still considered a temporary project pending further review, but the ruling had blocked the weapon she most relied on, permanent policy masked as maintenance, and that was enough. The installation remained intact. The chickens remained housed, and the plaza remained what it had always quietly become, a defiant proof of concept. After the hearing, Louise approached him again. She didn't speak at first, just placed her hand on his shoulder and nodded. Then she said, "It shouldn't have taken this much." And he agreed. But sometimes it does. In the days following the council's decision, the air around the plaza changed. Not dramatically, not in some cinematic reversal of fortune, but subtly, like the way light shifts across a room when a curtain is drawn. People who had once watched from their windows now walked through the space with a quieter posture, no longer uncertain whether presence implied allegiance. Children returned first, barefoot and careless, pointing at the hens, asking questions with the sincere curiosity of those untouched by politics. Their parents followed more cautiously, some with soft apologies hidden in compliments, others with offerings of unused planter boxes, seed packets, or time. Brandon accepted everything with quiet grace, not out of vindication, but because he knew what it had cost to bring them to this moment, not just his own effort, but the slow, painful erosion of fear in a place ruled for too long by silence disguised as civility. He repaired the damage from the earlier sabotage, but didn't erase all of it. A few charred edges on the cedar frame, a faint discoloration near the base where lime had killed the first planting bed. These stayed as they were, not out of neglect, but preservation. They told part of the story. They reminded him, and anyone who paid attention, that progress didn't come clean. It came stained, scraped, and fought for. His days resumed with familiar rhythm, tending the hens, maintaining the irrigation system, logging data, teaching. But everything now moved a little slower, less driven by adrenaline and more by intention. The project, once survival, had become endurance. Karen didn't resign. She didn't apologize. She didn't even publicly acknowledge the failed amendment or the conflict of interest her correspondence had revealed. But she receded in ways that mattered. She stopped issuing unilateral notices. Her name appeared less often on internal memos. She no longer appeared at every gathering. Power, Brandon realized, doesn't always fall with noise. It often dissolves quietly once its legitimacy erodes. The neighborhood didn't turn against her. It simply stopped following. Brandon received a call from the Office of Community Development 3 weeks later. The city had reviewed the site again, and based on the college's continued involvement and the council's inability to pass stricter zoning measures, they had approved a new designation: Community Ecological Microzone, Pilot Tier 1. It was a mouthful, but it came with permanence. The structure could stay. It could expand. It could, for the first time, stop being provisional. He read the letter twice, standing in the very spot where he'd once installed the Coop under cover of darkness, and allowed himself a single, audible exhale, the kind that comes not with victory, but with relief. That weekend, a group of volunteers came together to rebuild the damaged beds, this time with a more ambitious layout. Brandon let others lead parts of the process, stepping back where once he would have guarded every inch. A muralist from down the street offered to paint the back of the observation platform. A high school student asked if they could do a capstone project studying the nitrogen cycle using the Coop as a live case study. The space was becoming more than his. It was becoming shared. He didn't forget what had been done to him. He didn't forgive the silence of those who waited too long to speak, or the pettiness that tried to mask itself as order. But he also didn't let it rot him. Some nights he still caught himself walking the perimeter with a flashlight, not because he expected sabotage, but because habits formed under pressure don't vanish with paperwork. He kept the records updated, the permits current, the documentation airtight. He knew that peace in neighborhoods like this wasn't permanent. It had to be maintained like any structure. But there was joy now. Real, rooted joy. He watched as a toddler crouched in front of the Coop, trying to